So this is going to be informal. I'm going to pass this over to Linda for a second, but one of the questions that came up earlier was whether people can ask questions right in the middle of whatever we were talking about. And thought, yes, you can do that. You can ask a question, or if you want to put a question in the chat, we could always bring it up that way. If you want to share anything in the chat, you're totally welcome to do that. So, we like to have the discussions about what we read and see and all of that, because it's definitely a hefty topic and there's a lot to learn. So, Linda, you want to start us off?
All right. Just to reiterate what Sherry was saying, I think the vision for this group was that we have the hard stuff that we can read, the videos we can watch, all the different forms of possibly learning about it, because it is very challenging. It can be complicated, but it can be kind of easy too if you don't let yourself get bogged down with it. We want the 2-hour sessions to primarily be for you all, for the discussions of what questions you have. If you don't understand something, throw it out there. If somebody in the group has a really good way of explaining how they understand it, speak up. Feel free to jump in at any point in time. It's not really going to necessarily be a lecture type thing. It's going to be more of a, well, I read this before and I don't quite understand this. And we're going to kind of keep it focused around what we're doing each session to kind of keep it a little bit organized. But we want you all to participate, because several of you are pretty much beginners with it and some of you haven't even tested yet. So don't hesitate to ask the questions. And don't assume that it's a silly question or anything, because we don't know what we don't know. And we don't know it until we ask. Okay? So feel free to jump in. Didn't that sound good?
Yes, jump on in.
And no telling what I'll end up spitting out too.
What is it they say? Jump into the genetic pool, because that's
That's
where we
right.
all are. Yeah, there's going to be a lot of corny jokes. I'm just saying, because we
Yeah.
this is a subject you like to laugh with as you go along. So I know Randall had mentioned that he had not tested yet. How many of you have tested, and what companies have you tested with? So I've got 3 that have. What companies have you guys used?
I did Ancestry and My Heritage. I did both.
Okay.
Have you been working with your matches any?
Not really. I haven't uploaded it to the one where you match everything up. I go on and check. Yeah, I did match. I'm not sure I know how to do that, so I need to explore that. But I go back and check with cousins they come up with, on both of the other sites.
Right. But you can also use it on the programs you chose. You said Ancestry and 23andMe?
No, My Heritage.
My Heritage. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Both of those, each of the companies has their own way of working with matches. And I encourage you all throughout this to start looking at what your companies have, because we all learn in different ways. I tend to like Ancestries a bit because of I'm getting used to the matches and how they pop up and working through them. My Heritage has also got a well-known way of working with them, but you've got to get a little more comfortable with what's what to work with them, because it takes a while. But feel free to use those too, because GEDmatch will probably is a good way to throw in the matches, but you probably want to be a little more comfortable with the programs that you have. So I would encourage working on those and playing with those right now and seeing what you can get out of those.
So Joy said she tested with Ancestry. Michael, you raised your hand. Who have you tested with?
Yeah, I've tested with 3 and uploaded to a 4th. I've tested Ancestry. I've tested Living DNA. I've tested Family Tree DNA, all the Y, the autosomal, and the mitochondrial. And then I uploaded to My Heritage. I kind of like Ancestry's through lines, and My Heritage has a similar program on theirs that kind of lets you look at somebody. The problem is if your match has not loaded a tree to the site, you're not going to get anything. The other thing too is, as a beginner, and you do the test and then you get your matches, you're thinking, oh man, these are ancestors, these are relatives, cousins, blah, blah, blah. I can reach out and touch base with them. My ancestors are trying to hide from society because nobody wants to get back with me. I've had
It's a common.
I've had maybe two people, a third maybe, who've actually gotten back with me, and then two of them have kind of dropped off the edge of the world. One of them still staying in contact, but it's like you send out the emails and the letters and all this, nobody responds. And I think a lot of them, they're probably doing it for their ethnicity more than trying to find a cousin. And when they see third or fourth cousin, they really don't care. So the tree's not there, and it does me absolutely no good. It
And
does me no
sometimes,
good when they don't respond either.
right. And sometimes, especially ancestry, they want you to register if you do a DNA test now. Used to, you could register for somebody else, but now they want you to kind of sign up for it. Well, like I had my brother do an ancestry test. Well, he now has an ancestry account, but he's never on Ancestry. So you got to remember too that many times a lot of these matches don't even know what's going on because somebody else had them get the test. And so they gave the test and that's all they're thinking about. Now you should be able to contact the person managing it, but depending on how many tests they manage, it could get very difficult. And we will probably talk about some good ways of contacting matches to make it more efficient and likely, more likely to get a response with it. But just so you know, so far you're the expert on the living DNA.
True. I think you may be the first person I've met that actually tested with them. So yeah, you're definitely got to give us some insight into what their module looks like.
Yeah, because I have mine up on Family Tree, Ancestry, My Heritage, and 23andMe. I've not done the living DNA yet, and GEDmatch.
Yeah, and living DNA, their database is primarily, or they advertise primarily in the Great Britain area. And going on that and thinking about the matches that might come up, I thought, well, I'm primarily ethnicity wise from that area.
Mm-hmm.
I thought, well, maybe I'll find a lot of matches. Most of the matches are from the U.S.
Yeah.
Very few of them are Great Britain matches.
Part of that is the laws in the different countries. I think Germany is pretty strict in allowing people to take the DNA tests and stuff. And sometimes they've had to have people from the U.S. send them the kits to take the test and send them back.
Yeah.
So it depends on the laws and stuff for the countries too.
Yeah.
And also My Heritage is centered out of Israel. So it's also going to have European.
But I think My Heritage, I think whoever in Israel owned it, I think they sold it recently.
Did they?
Yeah, I believe so. But the living DNA, the one thing about that, if you've got, Great Britain area type heritage, they actually break down primarily where you might be from in like England, Scotland, and Ireland.
Mm-hmm.
And in my own case, I've got like about 6 or 7 different areas within the United Kingdom. And you can't, as small as they are, you wouldn't think there'd be that many areas to get focused on, but they really do break it down in that area. But again, it's the database and who you're testing with. And
yeah, and we'll get into that more next session with the ethnicity, but it does depend on the algorithms and the population that they're looking at. So you've already discovered some of the not so fun things with it.
Oh, Alice has put hers up. Ancestry, Family Tree DNA. Let's see. She did not only she did Family Finder and mtDNA. She's done living DNA, 23andMe, Find My Past, My Heritage, GEDmatch. Yeah, wow, she's done the whole selection. She's done great. And she had her brother do the Y-DNA with Family Tree DNA. So as of right now, that's correct, Linda, right? Family Tree DNA is the only company that will do Y. Is that correct?
Y and MT.
Okay.
The only company that does the Y DNA and the MT DNA.
Right. And after reading our chapters, Does anybody know why the Y is so important?
Why is why important?
The men should
Well,
pipe up on
let's
this.
back up just a little. Let's back up just a little bit because we have some brand new people in here.
Uh-huh.
Did everybody understand? Have any questions about the first chapter as far as what? Well, that was I think the history, but actually what DNA is, what it entails, which kind of goes to the why. Why is what the why looks at and stuff.
Right. And that's the one thing about chapter 1. I think chapter 1 usually makes me cross my eyes a little bit because there's so much terminology in there. There's a lot of heavy scientific terms that makes me think I can never understand this because I'm never going to remember all of these terms.
You
But
don't need to remember all of them.
Right, right. You don't. He goes into depth there that a lot of terms we don't even use really on the genealogy side. So, but yeah, those men should think that the why is very important. By the way, also Michael is correct. Just announced in February that My History has been bought.
Okay, I missed that.
I did too. I don't know how. I feel like it might have been a distant memory somewhere, like I saw, but I usually would focus because I've followed family or My Heritage for a long time. It says let's see, Francisco Partners purchased it. So,
Hopefully it'll be good.
Yeah.
But just so you know, we have 23 chromosomes. We have the X and the Y, which are the ones that determine sex. X is the female, Y is the male. With the Y DNA, what does that do? Somebody's sound is not on. Joyce.
Traces the father's line, right?
Right. Fathers, 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 fathers. All the way back. And same with the MT, but only with the mother. So when you're looking at the other chromosomes, just remember that there's 23 of them. And so, what gets passed down is not going to be everything on every single one of those chromosomes. And we're going to see that more in detail as we look at the matches. But does everybody kind of understand what DNA is basically? Those who've not done it yet or... Okay, and do you understand the difference between a genetic tree and a genealogical tree? What is a genealogical tree?
That's your paperwork.
Paperwork.
Based on primary records or whatever records you can find, right?
Right. That is the documentation.
Mm-hmm.
And the genetic tree is your DNA tree. Is it going to have as many people as your genealogical tree?
No.
Probably eventually more if you follow all the matches.
Maybe, maybe not, if you think about it. Because if you've got 4 first cousins, you may only match one of them DNA-wise. But paper-wise, you've got 4 cousins. They match each other, they're 4 cousins. But you may have only inherited from one of those cousins, or the same thing that, their parent had passed down, that was passed down through the line. And we'll get into that in more detail in autosomal. But that's, your genetic tree is technically going to be smaller. And that also, and we'll remember this for the next session, will impact your ethnicity results too.
And sometimes with like the diagram that he had on page 18 with it was D, where it talks about, shows your genetic tree. So even just being male or female, right, Linda, I'm saying this right, that being male or female, there are certain parts of the DNA that you won't inherit.
Right.
Like, it'll block that out just based on, there's only certain things that can be passed on based on whether you're male or female. So
in regards to the Y DNA and the X DNA.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
On the other things, it just depends, but the female does not have the Y. So she's not going to inherit anything from the Y. And we'll get into that in more detail when we get into that chapter. But it is, when it comes down to the Y and the X, that does make a significant difference in what is passed on.
And one great thing about Blaine's books is he always has at the end of each one of those chapters these core concepts. So if you get a little confused, sometimes I will read the core concepts first so that I know what I'm really supposed to be focusing on. One thing I thought was really interesting, and yet in hindsight, I'm like, well, I had heard of DNA testing as long. It says that that DNA companies began offering genetic tests for use in genealogy since 2000. We are past the 20-year mark. That's a long time. And I believe, let's see, didn't it start with the National Geographic group? They started doing it first, I think. Family Tree DNA then was the next one. So, and Family Tree DNA has continued. So they are the oldest company doing this, and they have their own lab. And they're the only ones that do the Y. So even though Ancestry has the largest pool as far as, people testing and you matching people, some of the significant tests that you may need could only be gotten through Family Tree DNA. One of the things though, in this chapter too, you're going to want to make sure that you keep those. It says the 4 different kinds of testing, which is mitochondrial, Y, autosomal, and X. So those 4 terms, you want to have those definitely emblazoned on your brain, because we're going to use those a lot through the next 6 months.
Right. And the primary one that you will use, like via Ancestry for the most part, is the autosomal, because they don't have it, but you can still utilize the other test results if you've got the list of matches and stuff, cross-referencing and stuff. That's where GEDmatch comes in, and there's other tools that can combine some of the companies together, because the more companies you have your DNA with, technically the more matches you will get, and sometimes the more relevant matches, because somebody may have gotten a free DNA test and tested at 23andMe. That's all they've done it with, and not any of the others. And yet, if you've tested at 23andMe, you'll show the match, but you tested the others, you wouldn't. So it is nice to have the larger pool to pull from.
Yeah, I will say, I know everybody's said, I've only had mine tested with Family Tree DNA, but I've uploaded mine to MyHeritage, GEDmatch. I think that's it. Now, yeah, I also have to be careful about the reversal. Like, for instance, I cannot upload my Family Tree DNA results to Ancestry. Ancestry does not allow that. You can download your Ancestry results and upload into other companies, but it won't work reverse. They won't allow other company tests in. So however, which way you're going, you got to be thinking about that too.
And just like when you're doing your genealogical tree, if you're going in for a specific question, think about what you're wanting to find out. And especially if you're going to want to get somebody else to do testing as well to find out if you're related. Because again, Family Tree only does the Y DNA and the mitochondrial DNA. You would have to go through them if you're wanting any of those tests done to compare to somebody else. But depending on the other companies. Another thing to think about when you're looking for somebody to test, if you want to find out a specific link as you work your way back in time, a specific question, the older the person that's tested, the further back you can go. A lot of times, okay? Technically, with autosomal DNA, you're only going to go back 4, maybe 5 generations, okay? But if you get somebody 95 years old, that's going to go back 4 generations, 5 generations from that person. So that's going to get you further back in time if you're wanting to take your tree further back. So there are tools to find out, to figure out things like that, as well as just who your current cousins are, or if you're related to this family or that family. Okay, so any questions on that?
I have one. Since you're dividing genetic tree from genealogical tree, is it best then to, I had never thought of this is why I'm asking, is it best to have 2 separate charts and keep them completely separate?
Well, you don't have to keep them separate, but you could possibly mark the ones that are DNA. Ancestry has little tags that you can put on your trees on there to identify like the DNA links and stuff.
Okay.
And I would say too,
You can't, don't want to rule out somebody that and say, well, we're not related if they don't show up in your matches, even though you've got documentation showing that they're a first cousin, because you just may not have inherited from them.
Okay.
and he talks about, in chapter 1, he talks about your genetic tree versus your genealogical tree. I think one of the biggest things that always was a hang up for me as far as DNA, I mean, like getting tested. In the very first part of chapter 2, he talks about, oh, the misconception number 1 is that DNA testing is just for fun. Well, I walked in the door with it being just for fun because I really just wanted to see my ethnicity results. The mental hang up for me has always been, well, okay, so let's say it goes back 5 generations ish that I can see. If there's one person that had a relationship outside of the marriage or the document trail that we know, what happens? I mean, I've got this document trail. How do I know that it's wrong? How do I know that the error is showing up? And so Blaine talks about it being another form of documentation. So this is another thing that you're using. So if you've got one tree, you can do it that way. And maybe if you encounter one of those errors in your tree or in your genetic makeup, you can note that. But it may get to where you might need an alternate tree. Depends on how big that might be.
And be prepared for that.
Sure.
Because
I heard a genealogy instructor one time refer to it as mama's babies, papa's maybes.
could be, and sometimes it's papa's babies and mama's maybes.
One never knows. I have
That's the thing, you never know. And that's kind of going in more into some of the misconceptions and stuff in the other chapter, but you really do got to think about various reasons for, and what they either say non-paternal event, NPE, or misappropriated parentage. But
Okay.
and that's because it could be due to any reason whatsoever.
Sure.
Back in 1800s, your neighbor's farm could have burned down and only one surviving child with no family. They may have absorbed him into their family.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
That's not anything. I mean, it's nothing. That's caring for the individual. And they grow up, and even though they may know that that's not their real parents, they may or may not know. But even if they do and never say anything about it, to them, that's the parents that raised them, just like in adoptions and stuff. And we also have to flip over and we have to look at the people on the other end of it, especially if you're looking at adoptions. Because I'm willing to bet you start digging in your tree and you think and you double grandparents every year back in there, you're bound to have some NPEs, misappropriated events. You're going to have some of those. And knowing the reason for them and thinking about the reasons for them can play a big part in understanding why they may not respond. Michael, you might have been contacting a cousin that found out that wasn't really their father and they're not ready to deal with that yet. Or somebody who's afraid that somebody's going to find out that they had a child back when they were messing around in high school or college and didn't know about it or didn't even know about it. There's cases where women got pregnant and never said anything to the fathers. There's all sorts of reasons out there. So we've got to approach those situations with a bit of caution and understanding, if that makes sense.
May I interject something here?
Yes.
And also there can be errors at the DNA company that's doing the testing. And I say that because my first cousin, I pushed him into getting one done. And when it came back, he did not match anybody on the paternal side. And his mother was having a heart attack. And she said, I had both of you boys, your daddy's children. And he got very upset. And for a year, he would not test anywhere else. He called back to that company and they said, oh no, they didn't make a mistake. Finally, after a year of me hounding him and his mother being upset, he did test with another company and he did test and match all the rest of us. So there can be mistakes made as well.
Yep. We're all people. And
Yep.
we utilize artificial intelligence, but it only can do what the people tell it to do.
Although I have to say, the first time I tested my mother, she came out with like 2% oceanic or like Pacific Islander, and I'm going, that doesn't make any sense. And then I thought maybe they had made some sort of mistake. Now, there's one thing over time, as you test with companies, over time, the ethnicity results will change because as more people join the pool, the strength and weakness of all of this stuff, will change over time. And so eventually they got rid of it. But for a long time, I thought there was something in the lab. It did eventually go Eastern a little bit, but genetically, I mean, my brother and I still totally matched everything, with her. It wasn't like there was some big error. I just think that was part of the algorithms in that case. But wow, that's a big error though, Penny. That's a big one to like where you just don't match the father at all. That's really scary.
That is scary. And that's why, again, you take it as a tool and, utilize it that way. And that's why the paper trail comes in handy too.
Penny, how long ago was that? Was that fairly recent or was that?
It was about 2.5 years ago.
Wow. There's
He's doing better now.
Big part of me that really wants to ask what company that was.
Well, his second test was with 23andMe, and I was watching it better than he was. I caught it before he did.
Okay.
And I messaged him and said, congratulations, you're a Charles. Call your mother and then call the other company.
Now we know, but that's okay. These are private videos. They're not going to the mass public, so we're okay.
But my point was just, like you said, the computer may not make a mistake, but people putting in info may.
Yeah.
And
Yes.
my thing was I thought at first maybe the test got swapped with somebody else, but he matched his mom. But he wasn't matching the other ones. And it was just a fluke, just a weird fluke, because when he tested with another company, and since then I have uploaded it to other companies and he is matched. So it's just a bad error that almost caused his mom to have a heart attack.
But some funny stories can come out of it too when you do the DNA. I found out, and Sherry's probably heard this a million times, but I love it. My maternal side is from West Prussia. So of course I don't have a whole lot of DNA matches coming through that area. And I have one line where a match contacted me and he said, do you know the story? And I said, what story? He said, well, when it was my third great grandfather came over the first or second time, he left his wife and kids at home. And then it was a year or two when he went back and got them and brought them over. Well, when he left, he had about 4 kids. When he went back and got them, he had 5 kids. And time went on and she led him to believe sorry, my cat's running across the screen here. And time went on and this child was getting ready to get married, or the descendant of this child was. And he was at the wedding with his entire family. And his, I guess it was grandmother or whatever, goes over to the bride and she says, don't worry. She said, your children are going to be smart. And the bride just kind of looks at her like, well, why? She said, because he's not the father. So then she ends up going to tell her husband, and he was shocked. And of course it ruined the whole wedding, but he was so mad that the last name was Kapitsky and he took off the ski, which usually means like son of. And so his name had been changed all the way down to just Kapitz, but they were still the same cousins on it. Now it was a horrible tragedy then, but there's nothing we can do to change it. And so it's kind of like, yeah, that would be something to get used to, but it is kind of a nice story to know. Now, that probably would have come out in DNA, which it did because his name is Kapitz, and that's how he ended up finding out the family secret there. But there's, you can't, you can take it to heart, but you got to look at it realistically that we're all just people and we make mistakes, we move, we go on. And some of it can be good and some of it can be cautionary.
There's a lot more secrets in our family tree than we realize, and DNA can uncover a lot of those,
Yes.
or at least within, reasonable generations, obviously. But yeah,
Okay. So I'm not even sure what time it is.
247.
Oh, okay. Let's go on to common misconceptions and myths. Do any of these surprise anybody? Or do you have any that you could add? Sherry confessed to doing the genealogy just for fun. And I remember that she was all focused on ethnicity.
Yep. And then I get heartbroken all the time when it changes. Although
Yes.
I still, to this day, that with these companies and their changes, I still that I think this is what's interesting is when you test the first time and you really don't know what you're looking at, or over time what you're looking at changes, more things start sinking in about what they actually mean. Now, if you have European ancestry, it's tricky. I've heard, I believe it was Blaine that actually said it, he said, if you think you're German, but you're not testing very heavy in German or whatever, he said, testing in those Northern European countries, France, Germany, England, even, he said, that's like testing to see whether you're Kentucky, Indiana, or Ohio. Genetically, we're so mixed in that area. So many military takeovers and everything over generations that we're just way more genetically similar, and it's really hard for these companies to have differentiation. So like my biggest surprise is that my mother and I tested between 10 and 15% Italian. I literally have no Italian anywhere on my tree. So I'm still very intrigued by that. Now, at one time I thought I at least found a female line that I got her within 90 miles of the Italian border, but we're talking like the 1600s. Now, does that mean her entire branch was Italian? Because they all migrated in the 1850s. So maybe I do have some strength there. Or I've got somebody that's not telling quite the truth somewhere in the line. And
Or there's a third possibility.
Mhm.
You didn't inherit any of the Italian DNA.
I did. I mean, me and mom did.
Okay.
So it's her side. I'm just saying that
Okay.
the strength of it surprises me. Like at first I look at the 10% and went, oh, well, that's, 1600s. Oh, sure, that's fine. But as I go further in time, I mean, as I think about it more and more, I'm like, wow, wait a second, 10% is kind of high. That's
Mhm.
may not be as far back as I think it is. I need to maybe look at some closer generations, to explain that high of a percentage. But
And that's one thing too I would encourage y'all to do that are relatively new to the DNA. Start out with the larger matches, the first cousins, second cousins, where you know there's a connection before tackling those smaller ones.
and
You know, my,
Michael said one thing that was very important about how so many matches don't have trees. If you were the one testing, or and you're controlling some accounts, go into these different companies, whoever you've tested with, just fill out a quick like 5 generation tree, so that at least they've got something to go on to see where they may match, and it can give them some tree clues. Because he's right. I mean, if you go into some place and you're matching people, sometimes I match people really closely, yet they don't have any tree. It doesn't give me, except for mom or dad's side, that's about as good as I can get sometimes. So yeah, do that for everybody else. That's a really helpful thing to do.
and we'll get into that later. The kind of the what the adoption people usually do. They kind of play zigzag with the trees because you work your way back, then you work your way forward, then you work your way back and forth a few times in order to build a tree on that. And we'll talk about creating, as some would say, quick and dirty trees that may not be as well documented as they should be, but you can document them better later. You're just looking to get the match connection with it. But we'll be spending more time on that because that really kind of gets involved with it. Anybody else any misconceptions that they hadn't realized? Or most of these I've seen before, and he did a good job of finding quite a few. And as we've noticed, a lot of them cover ethnicity, which is what a lot of people find. They think they know where they came from, and they find out on, especially those of us that have DNA on different trees. How many times have you compared your ethnicity on each of those trees? It's all a little bit different.
So what about misconception number 5? DNA testing will reveal my health information. How many testing companies do that now? I know 23andMe has from the get-go, but who else tests for medical?
I think, well, 23andMe specifically does test for medical and says they test for medical. I think that Ancestry is trying a little bit because they throw out feelers for health information and stuff. I don't think they're actually testing for it. I think they're trying to compete a little bit, if for lack of a better word, because as I've explained my concept in many ways, a lot of these companies are in it for profit, in it for money. They're competing with each other, which for us, that's good because we keep getting new tools that help us utilize the information they have. But some of the downsides is sometimes you get into some of this thing where you're not really sure who's accurate and who's not. Personally, I would say 23 is probably the strongest one as far as checking for health information, but you don't have to participate in that. And the same thing with Ancestry. But I've gotten a few questions from Ancestry about health, kind of going, oh, you guys are wanting to go there. And I don't necessarily at this point.
They may be more connected than we realize. I have heard, and you may be able to help me on this. I have heard that family tree DNA is the only one that has their own lab, that the other labs actually
Share
stuff. They share a lab. So they're sending their stuff to play. If Ancestry and 23andMe share a lab, I could see where it would be a very easy switch over for them to enhance whatever it is that they test.
And that could have been feelers to see if there was an interest in that.
Right. And that's lab processing. That's not algorithms for ethnicity. That's just lab. That's just the lab that the results.
Looking at the raw data.
Yeah. The results, that you get through the companies can be very different. So.
My son tested with 23andMe and got his health assessment, and he was showing me the results, and I just, I wasn't real impressed with the information, and I just felt like the added cost to get this information wasn't worth it for him. And he was like in his middle 40s at that time. And for those of us that are retired and in our 70s or 80s, what the hell difference does it make? We've already experienced those health issues, and we don't need a DNA testing company to tell us, oh yeah, you're probably going to get asthma. Well, excuse me, that information's too late in coming.
I think that I agree with you on that, but I do think the angle they're taking is your children or your future grandchildren and stuff, that if they're predisposed to this, then the doctor can be aware and test for this on it. And identifying different markers and stuff on where it's located to possibly deal with it genetically. I'm sorry,
there is a big, that is true. My gosh, as we go to the doctors now, how long is the list that they want you to, has anyone in your family ever had, like, how far back do you want? Do you want my DNA results? I mean, how far back do you want to go?
There's a downside to that, though. I think that people are afraid that insurance companies are going to hold that against them and not give them health insurance because they have pre-existing conditions. Even though they're not supposed to look at pre-existing conditions, I'm sure they still do.
That is misconception number 7 right there, actually,
Is it?
in the book. Yes.
Yep. Yeah, I was kind of surprised to see that, because I know that's been a fear of it.
Mhm.
And some places have created, and some states have been really good about creating laws to protect the DNA from stuff like that. But you always got somebody that's got to push the cart somewhere to try to get into it.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, insurance wise, I mean, Lynn and I both work for state government, and in order to get a certain rate on the insurance, we have to get like either a health assessment, or we have to fill out a questionnaire that reveals basically your health habits and things like that. So I could see why a lot of people get really nervous over this whole thing.
And
But
the sad
eventually,
thing is, yeah, but the sad thing is that you've got to realize too that just because your mother had this or your father had this, that doesn't mean they passed it down to you.
Mhm.
And the same with you passing it down to your kids. That you may or may not, and it's just going to vary. So they're using it for identifying, I think, genetic conditions and stuff. I can kind of see that, but as far as like your son and those of us getting older and stuff,
Yeah.
I don't see any use in it.
I think the only thing that worries me a little bit is over time, as we get more advanced in looking at DNA, what are they going to be able to pull out? I mean, what was it, the stories they had about, in fact, even he mentions in there that there's only certain parts of the DNA of the double helix
Chromosome.
of the chromosome that
Double
we're
helix, yeah.
able to read and interpret anything, and that there are strands of it that we don't know what they do. We're assuming the way all of this looks is it's genetic encoding, so it's telling the body what to do, and so there are strands that we still don't know what they do, and that's where things like memory come into play, and the effects of trauma on the body and things like that. So what's going to happen in the future if we get really, really advanced at reading what's in that chromosome? So who knows what science may deliver to us in the future generations.
Penny, were you going to say something? Or are you just stretching?
And she's stretching. Alice has reminded us too in chat about ethnicity based on the number of people tested at each company, and which makes, you can see some big result differences there. And she said Ancestry has the most number. Yes, that is true. Ancestry has the largest pool. And as we were talking about where some of these companies are based, so Ancestry is based out of the US, but like MyHeritage is based out of Israel. So, you're going to get more of a European testing pool. And then Living DNA, we've heard is a little bit, is more European. So, and in fact, you know what? Find My Past would also be that, because they were
Yeah.
based out of Scotland. So Find My Past is European based.
And several of the companies have jumped in and are trying to get the ethnicity down to specific locations,
Mhm, mhm.
which is kind of cool, because you can see Glasgow, Scotland is, oh, I need to look there, but
Yeah.
I got to get them over there first.
Right. Yeah.
How many of you have been building trees? How far back have you got some of your genealogical trees?
My husband's goes back to 1170 AD in England. Mine, 1780. That's as far as I can go.
Well, now, I've got to say this, and I've said this to every DNA class we've done. I'm a Spencer. My brother did the Y DNA. We go back to Spencer's, but I've not made the connection to Princess Di yet.
You will eventually. Here's hoping, right?
That's right. Here's fingers crossed.
There you go.
What about other misconceptions? Did any of them strike you as kind of, wow, I didn't quite realize that?
Well, actually, I think we ought to talk. Let's dig deeper into that misconception number 7 about, says the government or my health insurer. I think privacy. Randall actually brought up, since he has not been tested yet, he brought up his his hesitation based on privacy,
Mhm.
and a lot of that. How do we, how are we ensured that this is you know, basically that it's a secure thing to do, especially moving forward in these companies, and we have no control over these companies. And I think I will preface that by saying, in the news, I mean, most of these companies have these privacy agreements that you sign anyway as you go in. This naturally does segue into the ethics of everything, so we're going to get there very soon. But I'd say the biggest one that has probably made the news the most was GEDmatch. And so GEDmatch is a third-party tool. It's not an actual testing company. And so people choose to upload their results, their raw results from whatever company they've tested through, uploading that. They had privacy agreements, but then they changed one. You remember, Linda, I don't remember, they changed it to the point where they were allowing law enforcement to use it as a tool to catch criminals, and they were not telling the people, or altering, I believe, their privacy agreement. So they got their hand slapped in the news over that. And some people have chosen to not use GEDmatch based on that. So, but the companies, as far as I know, the actual testing companies so far have not had any major blunders or problems with privacy and testing, right?
Right. The biggest factor that you've got to think about with the testing on DNA, even with the criminal part of it, and it in the ethics part of it, you don't want to opt somebody in unless you've gotten permission to opt them in. But I think now GEDmatch automatically opts you out, and you have to opt in order to allow police to look at your DNA. But as far as them being able to come back on you with any of that DNA, they can't do it with the DNA they get out of the companies, because you have got the chain of evidence. And that chain of evidence, there is no real chain of evidence that falls into the legally, we can do this thing. Even when they used the DNA from GEDmatch to build out the trees, they still had to go and get DNA from whom they narrowed it down to. And realistically, our DNA is out there. It is out there. If somebody wanted to go through our garbage can, pick up a cup after we drink something out of it, if you smoke a cigarette, they eat cigarette butts, you know, we leave our prints everywhere. It's out there. And it's got to be a personal thing. I know there's people that just absolutely will not. And there's people that do not want to know their family history for whatever reason. I haven't gotten my husband's test yet because he says he knows all he needs to know about his ancestors.
He doesn't want any more surprises, right?
He doesn't want any surprises on there. And we have to respect that. Even though we want to clock them and say, you know, you make this a lot easier if we could do this. But we do want to be respectful of that. But it is a decision you've got to make. And it's even more significant if you're trying to get DNA from somebody else, get them to test. Make sure they're totally aware that there are no guarantees on it. But because there are no guarantees, there's also not much they can really do with it. You know, if you downloaded your raw data, I don't know if any of you have downloaded it and looked at it, but it makes no sense to me. But you know, it's like looking at your computer programming languages, and sometimes, you know, I don't know what that comma or dot means there or here or whatever.
Although I would encourage it. I have to say that, I mean, since my father recently passed, I do have his, not only was he tested in Family Tree DNA, but Family Tree DNA keeps the sample. So I can, even though he's only had autosomal done, I can upgrade and get that Y done, which is really comforting to know that they do that. But because I've uploaded it into other companies or other platforms, I do have his raw DNA, that file. And I'm like, I was just thinking the other day, I'm like, okay, I need to make sure that that file is really protected, shared with my brother, shared with, so that we don't ever lose that. Because just in case something like, you know, let's say Family Tree DNA goes under and they lose their files or whatever, we've got that raw file that we could use in other companies. So that's going to be a really important kind of a genetic family heirloom that I'm going to want to make sure I pass down over the years if I can.
And we were talking about GEDmatch a little bit. There is also another tool that you can download on your computer to where you can take your DNA from the various companies and download it into, I think it's GEDmate Pro, and it will bring all your matches together and stuff, and you just kind of update it every month or so.
What's that
And all of
called?
this, I think
GEDmate?
GEDmate Pro, I'd have to look it up. I haven't looked at it in a little while. I need to get back to it. But they will not take Ancestry. Ancestry will not let them. You are not supposed to upload from Ancestry.
Now you can download you can pull down your raw DNA results from Ancestry, but you're right. They even don't want you to upload it to GEDmatch. Like they tell you, I think in the agreements that you do, like they don't want you to upload it into any other, but I mean, it is yours. I mean, that's up to you
Right.
really, but
But,
the
yeah.
agreement that you usually sign up with, so that's contract law, that
Yeah.
kind of, so be careful. I'm just saying that, people
Yeah, but
still upload them to GEDmatch.
Well, and with GEDmate Pro, they've got the program where they can go into that company and download it,
Hmm.
but they can't do it with Ancestry. There's a block there,
Mhm.
which that's where you really want the matches to go to make it a little bit easier with the other matches, but that's the workaround.
And they didn't used to. I mean, my brother was only tested in Ancestry. And so, yeah,
Yeah.
I downloaded it and they used to, yeah, I got him into GEDmatch before they changed anything like that. So,
Okay. Which I think we've talked about not sharing, we don't share every bit of DNA with everybody. And some people say, what's the point of getting siblings? Well, sometimes that sibling can fill in their genetic tree is going to be different from your genetic tree.
and that ties right into misconception number 8 about because my mother, father, sibling shares ATDNA with genetic match, I should also share that. And
Right.
it explains how siblings, especially siblings of different gender, I don't know if that's the appropriate word, but the different genders, they will inherit different things. And so you may not
Right.
have a match with certain people.
Right. And I don't want to get too deep into it because it could be a little bit confusing until we hit down the road.
Yeah.
But if you are looking for a particular question, are we related to this person? It might not hurt to have siblings test as well. I went ahead and got spit from my 3 brothers. So between the 4 of us, we can pretty much put our parents together in a sense. That doesn't mean we've got everything, but we've got quite a bit that we can rule in or out on that.
And you were tell this story too about like Native American DNA, but you said is it your brother and your son?
Yeah, my
don't?
brother has like 1% of the Native American DNA marker that does it. I have none, but my son has 2%. So it's like, okay, did that come down through the Y then on that? And through the X, he would have gotten the X he would have gotten my X from my mother's mother's mother.
And when we talk about this kind of thing right here, what she's talking about, like the X and who gets what or whatever, these chapters we're going to read goes way more in depth with this. So don't get confused. It'll all get more explained the further we read, the further we go.
And hopefully something will click down the road. And when it does, say, okay, wait a minute, let's back up. When you said such and such, how does that play out with what I've read about here on that? So don't feel like, I feel in some ways like maybe we're overwhelming you a little bit if you've not done it. But this is kind of more of the overview of things to watch out for, be careful of, prepare yourself for. And as you start working with it and playing with it, then you might want to go back and say, wait a minute, I read something about that. Oh, that's a misconception. I need to rethink this or look at this or consider this part of it. I think we're doing good.
The only one I can see, I think we've covered, let's see, misconception 10, we've kind of covered. My ethnicity estimate from the testing company should match my known genealogy. Well, in fact, he uses a phrase in here, reference population. So it's directly related to the pool of people they've had tested. So that's why each company is going to be different in those estimates there. So don't panic if that happens. And then the other one, I'm actually going to run, I need to do something. Misconception number 11, the relationship prediction
Yeah.
provided by testing companies. Linda, if you want to do that, I will be right back.
Yeah, I was looking at that one. That is something that you need to remember as well. Okay, has anybody compared the relationships and stuff? Have you dug that deep yet? And looking at how you're related, whether it's a first cousin once removed versus second cousin, or do you, at this point, are you taking what they suggest as the relationship?
I haven't dug that deeply recently. When I first had mine done, I found someone they said was a first cousin. Turns out it was a cousin that my sister and I had been searching for since I was a little child.
Wow.
And so actually the tree was uploaded by his son. So he is my first cousin. The son would be the first cousin once removed.
Right.
Didn't know he had children, didn't know where he lived, didn't even know if he was still alive. But through my very first ancestry DNA test, I found him and we reconnected, which was a pure joy because I hadn't known what happened. Both the parents were dead, didn't know where the boy had gone. He was probably about 10 or 15 years older than me, didn't know where he was at all, didn't know if he still existed. But it was a joy to find him. But I haven't done much past that.
Yeah, I would, as we're getting into this, pull up your paper tree, your genealogical tree, and kind of take a look at what are first cousins, second cousins, once removed. It takes a while to wrap your head around that. And sometimes I have to sit and look at it going, okay, first cousin once removed. My first cousin is Peggy. Peggy's daughter was the next generation. So that's my first cousin once removed. Sometimes you have to put it in with people you know in order to get it. Some people just have it automatically, but that is a challenge for me sometimes, is getting it. What you inherit, you get about 50% from each parent. Okay, that's pretty close, 50%. But you get about 25% from your grandparents, approximately, not necessarily exact. So you might end up with 24% and 26%. It just varies. And then it cuts down in half the next generation. Okay. But that 25% is not the same 25% for your brother or your sister or somebody else. That's a different 25%. It's like taking a bowl of vegetable soup, scooping out enough in a bowl, and you have two bowls there. One's going to have more peas in it than the other one. And, that's kind of the way the DNA is going to fall. So you may have a range of DNA, but that range incorporates different relationships that you may share with that individual. And we're going to get into that more when we look at, and if
I
you
think
want,
that's the biggest thing I've learned today.
Yeah.
Because I wasn't aware of all that.
Okay. DNA Painter. If you go into DNApainter.com, there is let me pull it up. Blaine and these guys are just awesome. The English dude that came up with the thing with Blaine is just,
Johnny Pearl.
yes. I couldn't think of his name, but
What's his name?
Johnny Pearl. It's
John
Okay.
Pearl. Yeah.
P-E-R-L.
Jonperl.
I think it's P-E-R-L.
Yeah, I think
Instead of
John,
regular
Jon, no H. Oh, come on now.
Yeah, that's the biggest news to me is that two siblings can inherit entirely different DNA from the same parents.
Yes.
That's interesting.
Yeah, no H. Jonny Perl is his name. I see in the chat window from Alice talking about family tree DNA that they're asking for bigger samples. I hope his is still good. It's I don't know maybe 3 years old, something like that. So we'll see. but if not, I still have a brother. I can send it in at least to get the Y, but yeah, that's interesting though, to see how much, although you said that you did go ahead and have them sample or run that older sample and you did get results. So yeah, I will just have to insist they try if they
Yeah, I'm
need
going
an
to
extra
put
one.
this
Just let it
in the,
happen.
oops, sorry.
Mhm.
I'm going to put this in the chat box,
Oh.
DNA Painter.
Mhm.
It should take you right to it. But what it does is it shows you half cousin, first cousin, once removed, different relationships, and what the likelihood is of falling into that relationship. What It's an interactive thing. So pull up some of your matches, put in the centimorgans, which if you looked at the little video, that kind of explained what those were if you didn't know.
If that's too confusing or too advanced, just yeah, silence your ears. We'll get there.
Well, but yeah, if you haven't even tested yet, but that is one tool that they created for us that can help show you the possibilities of what the person is to you. If the match is a half aunt or half uncle or a half first cousin once removed, it gives you a visual description of that. And that helps me a lot of times kind of put and see the options for how we're related. Because the centimorgan range is not telling you how much, where, or whatever. It's just giving you that number of the match. And so sometimes you have to figure out, and if you've got what I have, like in Eastern Kentucky, it's pedigree collapse where I've got 4 lines that go back to the same Spencer, then which one are we related to? It's going to skew the results a little bit. But if you've got results already, go ahead and try it and see, and just keep it handy too for future use because you'll go back to it. But if you don't even have to play with your results or whatever, just throw in there the centimorgans and it'll show you where they may fall, and you can kind of think about that. Does that make any?
My heritage is good. They have been sending out since I put mine. They've slowed down recently, but it's been like a year or two. So they sent out a lot of emails saying this is probably your third to fifth cousin. This is fourth cousin maybe, and it'll give you a range of possible connection.
And
And I
this
don't
will
think
too.
Ancestry does that, but my heritage has been doing that, which is
Yeah.
one reason I like theirs.
Yeah, the DNA Painter tool will do that as well. It'll give you a percentage of what it is
Good.
likely to be. It's more likely, it's 90% chance of it being, first cousin once removed versus the lower one, and it could fall anywhere in that category.
So,
Right.
That's
so
where
Lin-
paper trail comes into play really well.
so Linda, can you talk a little bit about the difference between something like DNA Painter and through lines in Ancestry? Are they similar? Are they?
Through lines, I'm not a big fan of through lines. If you go at the further back you go. And the primary reason being, my dad has not tested. I have an uncle that for some reason they weren't satisfied with the first test results and he tested twice. So if I go over there to through lines, it is showing my uncle not only as my dad suggested through lines, but also my uncle. Now, when that first came out, I sent them emails saying, this isn't right, but I've never seen any, I'm still having that pop up. It's going to be based on what they're pulling out of the trees. Okay. So when they give you a suggested person, always, always check the documentation. Make sure that you've got documentation to support that. If you don't, question it, because there's trees on there. And I admit, some of my peripheral cousins and stuff that I've not really paid a lot of attention to, some of them have wrong information in them. Because I look at something and goes, okay, that sounds right, or somehow or another that connected and became attached to it. And I appreciate when people say, no, this is the right one. When you pull from other trees on Ancestry without finding the supporting documentation, you're taking a risk of following the wrong tree back. And then DNA is going to point that out to you. Yes,
Yeah.
Michael.
Might add to with Ancestry, when you go onto a particular ancestor and you hit the hints, at the very top, the hint is other ancestry trees.
Right.
The thing you're going to run into and the problem you're going to have, a lot of individuals who are just on here, and I've seen people with 6,000 names on their family tree, and I'm struggling with, less than 1,000. I'm thinking, how in the world did they get all these names? A lot of these folks just go on there and they see someone else's tree that looks like an ancestor of theirs, and they just plug the name in. And it's like you said, they don't have the backup documentation.
Right.
Now, like in my case, I will use some of that as a hint,
Exactly.
but if I can't find some kind of documentation, then I don't consider them to be a part. So when you're doing your through lines with Ancestry, and it's based on somebody having a family tree out there, you're still poking, hoping, that you got right information.
Right.
And it's like you said, don't take it for gospel until you've backed it up yourself and got that data, to prove that so-and-so is your great-grandfather's sister's great-granddaughter,
Yeah. I wish that there was an emphasis given, because one of the things that hit me just recently, and it was same thing with Find a Grave, is that I wish people that wanted to put the right information out there, but didn't have necessarily the full paper documentation, had the ability to say, this was passed down through the family. Or this, I know this is the cousin because of such and such. That doesn't mean that it's accurate or right or the right documentation, but it can give you an idea of where they got the information from. Especially like on Find a Grave. How do you know that? Well, you're putting this information on Find a Grave. That's a family member. If it's your close family, you're more likely to know than I am if it's distant family for me. And if you say, well, Aunt Myrtle passed this down, or we've got the Bible, or we've got papers where grandma was writing all this down and she was there when he was born type thing, then you're on the right track. And in DNA, we do use quick and dirty trees. But again, you want to document if you go any further with that. If you establish a connection, make sure you've got the documentation to support that. Because it will lead you down the wrong trail. And the disappointment on people's faces when they say, yeah, DNA had the wrong person, so I've got them back 7 generations, and now I got to start all over again. Because as soon as you hit that wrong person, everything beyond that's, an error. Okay, so do we want to get into any more comments or questions on the misconceptions? Do we want to get into the ethics and thoughts on the different ethical issues?
It is 3:24, so we probably should move on to chapter 3.
Has any of these hit you all of going, oh, I really didn't think about that? I admit some of those I was going, oh, that didn't occur to me. Randall, what are you thinking about things?
Well, I'm not overwhelmed, but because I appreciate this, I knew that I didn't know much about it going into it. So I'm learning a lot, and I appreciate all the comments I've heard.
Good.
But I'm not sure if I could contribute anything at the moment.
It's okay. I just didn't want you to feel like you were totally way out there.
I hope by the end of the class, the end of the series, that by then you'll feel educated enough to make a decision one way or the other, whether you want to do this or not.
I think
There's a lot of knowledge here.
Yeah.
I think a lot of this is based too, for those of us that have been milking Social Security and Medicare for quite a few years. a lot of this flows back to what the medical community calls HIPAA.
Mm-hmm.
And they are so restrictive as to what can be shared and what cannot be shared, that I think most of this in chapter 3 related to HIPAA and what I'm dealing with medical appointments, it just all makes common sense,
Yeah.
based on where our society is at this
It's
point.
something that you don't necessarily think about originally. And I think that was, with GEDmatch and the law enforcement thing, I don't think they intentionally went in there to do something that would upset people. I think it was, oh, hey, this is a good idea. We can use the DNA here and, solve these crimes. And that's just absolutely wonderful. And then they started realizing, oh, wait, there's issues with that. And you run into like the HIPAA, which can be frustrating, but it makes sense. I mean, put yourself in a position. Do I want my stuff all over the place, or do I want there to be, a chain of process that we must do so that we're all aware?
And going back to this chapter 3, I mean, it's even as much as, unless given permission, I cannot even talk to my wife's doctor about her condition,
Right.
despite how serious it is, unless she has signed
Mm-hmm.
a release that allows me to be able to talk her issues. And even though she's my spouse, I can't talk her issues unless she's given permission.
Right.
Like I said, that all flows back to this chapter 3, and it just, the whole chapter just makes common sense in my mind based on my experience with the medical community.
Yeah. And I think, it's a common sense concepts, but it's again one of those that sometimes people just aren't really thinking. They're so focused on getting the answer to this DNA question that, well, I'll get cousin Timmy's DNA. Oh, sure, you can have my DNA, without either one knowing what's happening. And if you cut the misappropriated parentage, where are you then? I mean, that you don't know what the DNA is going to expose.
In fact, on the curriculum, there's a keep handy section where I've got some of the ethics standards that they have come up with over the past few years. And I heard somebody say that, you know what, if you're going to go around to your family members and beg for spit, that you need to, go ahead and print out a little pile of these little ethics standards just to give to the family member, to give so that they're educated about it. And whichever testing company you're going through, make sure they have the privacy policies and everything. Now, some of them may just be like, whatever, I don't care. Well, give it to them. There, you've done due diligence as far as giving them the information to know how, this is kind of serious in a way. I mean, we can't just totally dismiss it. It's genetic. It's your spit. It's once the labs have them, well, family tree DNA. Once they have that, that's not going away. And the implications, I think that's the thing. A lot of them would probably dismiss it and say, oh, I don't care, whatever, you can have my spit. But like you said, Linda, they're going to care if they come back and somebody's grandmama is not their grandmama, or vice versa, or a parent even, or they come up with an unexpected sibling they didn't know about somewhere in the matches. I mean, it can get serious really quickly. And so I think to have those lists handy that you can share with family members, that's a good approach to do it. And I think also ask them about, a lot of people, once we beg for the spit, we then manage the account.
Right.
Well, how do we do that? How do we, do they want access to it or don't they want access to it? I mean, like my brother does not care. He does not want any. He's just like, whatever, you keep it. It's fine. The only thing he wanted was the map of the ethnicity map. Once I got that done, I'd like to have a picture of that, he says. And that's all. He doesn't want anything else. But, when he has kids, how do I do that? How I pass that on? I mean, these are all things we need to think about.
Well, and yourself as well, because if you ask this second cousin that you just connected with this past year through COVID to do a DNA test, you're getting to know them, but do you really know them to know how they would feel if something comes back unexpected? What do they want to know? Because not only do you ask them, what do you want me to do with this? Here's this available for you, but you also want to ask them, what if something comes back, do you want to know? Do you want your family to know? Depending on what it is, it could be, you find out that there's somebody there who's not biologically, DNA wise, a member of the family. Who do you want to know? Because people are heartbroken. There's a adoption Facebook page where they work with people who are looking for their real parents who've been adopted. And, it's heartbreaking to see the heartbreak that is experienced by those who they want nothing to do with me. And that's a possibility. And what do you do then? Do you contact the kids that are your half siblings, even though the mother wants absolutely nothing to do with it? We don't know what position that mother was in when it happened, right? So we don't know what heartbreak she's going through, or if she's eventually going to pop up and say, this was somebody who attacked me, and I don't ever want to think about it, and I don't want the family to know. I kept it a secret. I did it when I was a real young child. Or, there's so many different cases there, and they need sometimes time to process it.
And in one fell swoop, those DNA results can be bypassing state laws where they have sealed adoption records, and sometimes with good reason they've sealed them. But then you get into the debate over the right of the child to know their ancestry. There's a whole layer of debate there and things that you got to think about. But yeah, it's happening a lot. DNA is, I think, they're bypassing laws they don't realize they are, just because, surprise, people just didn't know about some of this.
Yeah, you see every now and then stories on the news where the kids got the parents, got the whole family DNA kits for Christmas present, and then all of a sudden out comes the family secret, and it can be devastating. And then where does that put you in the position? Do they want you to keep that withheld totally, or what if what if those half siblings contacted you about what you know about the situation, and yet you got the DNA from the mother, or from somebody else? Do you share that or not?
Does anybody listen to or follow Dear Myrtle in genealogy? She does some YouTube instructions and things, various topics in genealogy. She just recently, I think a couple days ago, somebody got after her because she shared very similar to what Blaine has here on. I know I'm kind of sneaking back to chapter 2 for a second, but on page 33, he has this, he's got a little kind of example of his matches and who they are. He doesn't blur out anything. They've got, the username. Somebody got after Dear Myrtle because she shared a capture of her matches, and they were like, oh, privacy wise, you should have, redacted out those users or whatever, because those could have been real names. They could have been identifiable in the privacy. And I'm like, oh gosh, I hadn't even thought about that. I mean, because they're right. I mean, they're right in a way. If you're sharing this information, how do these people? But a lot of that's also user agreement. I mean, I don't think they can accept complete anonymity. I mean, unless they use a name that's completely, no one can identify them and they're just in there for matching that. That's, one thing. But yeah, that was something I had not even thought about.
And on the flip side, and they do this when the police have been looking at the DNA, and like CeCe Moore, this one of the tools that she uses to help identify current people that you don't have a lot of documentation for due to privacy because they're still alive and that kind of stuff. You'd be amazed what you can find if you put in somebody's email address. That can pull up all kinds of things. So if you're doing a presentation or sharing or anything like that, if I share anything like that and I haven't done it, smack my hand and, clock me, whatever. But I usually try to remember to, just block that out, because it may take a minute to mark it out, but
that was one of the workarounds she mentioned in GEDmatch, wasn't it? That was one of the things that that she was using to find identities, because they were like jumbled just usernames, and she didn't know that. And so, yeah, you're right. She was grabbing their emails. I forgot about that. Just Google
Yeah,
them.
she was grabbing emails and daggone, I don't know if you all work with Ancestry much, but if you get in there, you might be able to find your most recent address and name in the directories and stuff they have up. Because I've come across, it's like, oh, wait a minute, why do I have a hint for my husband? Oh, wait, that's our address and it's current.
Right. I'm really, really, really surprised. I ran across that recently, found some, stuff about myself. And I just thought, why are we so worried about living people on trees if Ancestry is completely bypassing that and getting, but I mean, there's so many pieces of information about us that are public record that's out there that people could grab. And so I don't know. I think it's disconcerting, I think, in a way that it's so easy to pull out some of this stuff. But because for years we were all hiding our, the living people. Don't put that on there. And how many times on a credit card they'll say, well, your security question is what's your mother's maiden name or your grandmother's maiden name, and we genealogists, we won't ever use that question because we know that's a little too easy to figure out. So it's crazy. And in fact, talking about CC Moore, if those of you who don't know who she is, she's one of the top genetic genealogists in the country, and Henry Louis Gates Jr. uses her in Finding Your Roots, that TV show. And she was the one that she was the one that caught the Golden State Killer, wasn't she? I
I
think.
think so, yeah.
Yeah, using Judd Match. And so she does this a lot. She works for law enforcement a lot, but she works through a DNA lab or processing company. And when she spoke in Louisville, what was that a couple of years ago, I guess. And she was talking about that company has the ability now, as science is moving forward, that company now has the ability to take a DNA sequence, and then they will try to recreate, or they will make a facial reconstruction to see what the DNA markers, what that person should look like. And she showed us example. It is scarily accurate. And so I'm looking for the day. I'm like, ooh, when can we do that for our ancestors? I'd love to see what our ancestors actually look like. But I would imagine that's kind of harder because you're getting little snippets of DNA, not a full picture of someone. But in a crime scene, when you've got that full genetic, sample from somebody to do
Well,
that.
and they have already moved to the point, it's kind of expensive now, but if you've got any old letters where they licked the envelope,
Mhm.
they have been able to get DNA from that.
Yep.
And I think it's like $1,000 now for them to,
Yeah.
run a
And
test.
that's just the testing attempt to see whether the
Yes.
sample you got off that envelope is viable or not. If it's not, you just lost $1,000. But I look for that as the advances get better. In fact, I think they've said so far their best attempts, and this one actually kind of threw me. They said the best attempts they're getting is under the stamp instead of the envelope, because the envelope can be corrupted quite a bit. And I'm just like, well, how many times did somebody give somebody the envelope though, but somebody else put the stamp on it, or so that could totally throw your DNA off. But yeah, science is definitely galloping along. So who knows what's going to happen in the future.
Yep. Okay.
Oh yeah, Alice has got a comment in there about sperm banks, and then years later, DNA showing, because yeah, they signed, it's bypassing all these signed agreements. When that's happening, they're signing all these agreements to stay anonymous. Whoops, and there's no more anonymity there.
Just saw the movie that Vince Vaughn did where he was the daddy of 1,000 sperm bank. He was trying to be the daddy for all of them. But that's part, and see, that's something too that may come out as a misappropriated parent, and people can all of a sudden jump to conclusions, and it could just be there was a problem, we had to use a fertility clinic, and that was the reason.
Heck, there's been terrible stories of, it was the fertility doctors that were actually fathering the children instead of the husband coming in. So I was like, oh good gosh, we're going to see all kinds of crazy things.
There's good things and there's not so good things that come out of it, but sometimes if it can bring together lost cousins and stuff like the one, that's good.
Can they do they do DNA off of blood specimens?
Off of blood specimens?
Yes.
Not that they're advertising, let's put it that way, but those companies that are advertising about with the spit off of envelopes, those are probably the people I would approach first to ask, because I have not heard that yet. I'm also waiting for them. I'd like them to test hair clippings, even though I know there's probably a high probability it can be corrupted in a way, but
They
I
have,
look at the
they've-
hair clippings.
they've been doing that, the hair
they?
clippings. Now, the
Well,
blood,
I guess
I'm-
my question about the blood specimen and going back to anonymity and privacy and all of that. Excuse me. You go into the hospital because you're sick, and then they have to draw blood to do some tests. You don't sign anything, that you go in, they get
Right.
your blood. If you're a blood donor, and some of these people
Right.
donate blood, every 6 weeks,
I don't think it's
where's
good
the
a concept.
anonymity in that? If you can do a DNA test off of blood, that kind of puts you in a conundrum.
Well, I'm trying to think when they used to do paternity tests, court-ordered paternity tests and stuff. I don't know how they did those. If they drew blood to get those tests to determine.
Yeah,
That or not.
back in the day they did, because it was like what blood type possibility was some of it, is what they were.
Yeah, some of it was the blood type and that kind of
I heard
thing. But
somebody in this group was a nurse, weren't they, or someone worked at the hospital?
was it Joy?
Was it Joy? Did you work for the medical? I can't
We
remember.
can't see her expressions to know if she's with us or.
Oh gosh, but yeah, I thought it was more blood type for paternity back then, before we had DNA availability. But yes,
Yeah.
I mean, yes, it is definitely feasible to trace someone's DNA through blood types. Just commercially is what commercially,
Yeah,
I
I
don't
don't-
think that anybody offers it yet. It's just medically. Yeah, that is definitely a possibility. They can do that.
I'd say they're staying away from that part of it because you're getting too close into HIPAA and other areas of concern.
Hmm.
It'd be like pulling it out of the brain or something, brain samples, and take the
Yeah,
blood sample.
I think my issue with that is more from the standpoint of people who don't want to do a DNA test because they don't want their information out there. And yet at the same time, they've told me at 1 o'clock today, they don't want to do a DNA test. And at 3 o'clock, they're over at the hospital giving a blood specimen.
I bet they can't
You know?
because that's an invasive procedure. Sticking a needle in your arm is an invasive procedure. And that would require a lot more oversight and stuff like that. So I'd say that's why the companies are avoiding it. Because with this spit, you spit that out, you're not taking anything. But when you're sticking a needle in the arm, that's invading the body
Yeah.
stuff and pulling it out. I think that because it's an invasive procedure that it is a no-no.
I guess I'm surprised that doctors and hospitals aren't analyzing the DNA though for medical, what is it, that predilections or whatever, that, your odds of having certain things. I'm surprised they're not giving us some sort of chart on, like with 23andMe. Now, they're not going to get into matches. They're not going to share your DNA with anybody because that would violate HIPAA, but I'm surprised they're not giving us some sort of DNA analysis.
That's because they're leaving it for the research. They're more involved in treating the individual as opposed
Yeah,
to
But
what.
but if your doctor, I mean, your GP is wanting to try to, is preventative medicine. That's part of some of the approach they do with you. So as far as your risks, and they ask you that questionnaire, you have to check all the different boxes that
Right.
anyone in your family members, any of your family members have suffered from certain things. So they're trying to predict the future a little bit. So I'm really surprised they're not using some of that blood and giving you some sort of, but my assumption is that the labs partnership just hasn't went that direction yet.
I'd say that'd be too costly because the labs are concerned about analyzing what's in the blood and stuff now for what's present.
Yeah.
Because even when they do a genetic test for a genetic condition, I would say they send it off to a lab, have to send it off and wait for it to come back.
You just have not come together yet. maybe someday, who knows? But yeah.
Well, we've gotten into outer space now.
I don't know. They're about to release the UFO information. We might as well just jump on board there.
Wouldn't, not much surprises me.
By the way, do you remember, Linda? I was reading, maybe I'm wrong, and I could possibly go find it, but did he cover genetic exceptionalism in the first edition of the book? Why do I feel like that
I think
term?
so.
That was a new term for me, was genetic exceptionalism, which is something that we just mentioned a little bit, a few minutes, well, really more than a few minutes, about a half an hour ago. We were talking about, you know, our trees and the necessity to make sure that your trees are well researched and everything. And it says genetic exceptionalism is the theory that genetic information is unique and must be treated in a different way from other genealogical information. However, all genealogical relevant record types, including DNA, emphasizing his stance that DNA tests, that's just another tool for your tree, are capable of revealing known and unknown information, including family secrets. As a result, many genealogists reject the idea that DNA should receive special or different treatment. So it's you know, it's really wrapping this whole, this is why DNA and understanding DNA testing for genealogy is really very important, because we also, I think, have to turn around and be educators in a way, the more we learn about this, because you've got so many people that will test and think that, oh, that's all they need. They'll test and they'll learn their tree. And therefore they don't, you know, we then as genealogists have to come back and go, whoa, hold up. Your document tree has to be really, really researched well and documented before you can rely on all this stuff. And that the DNA is just a tool, but it's a tool that's just gaining, it's gained so much in popularity. It just exploded. So yeah, I think that's a really good genetic exceptionalism. Good term.
Yeah, and remember too that your DNA is unique. We're
Say
still,
that again. You're what?
it's unique.
Yeah.
My DNA is unique. Your DNA is unique because what we inherit just depends on what was passed down.
Mhm.
So unless you are identical twins, your DNA is unique.
And even then, I think I've heard that identical twins have teeny, there's a little bit. There's
A little bit
sometimes
that
a
can
little
be,
bit
yeah,
what
different.
can be different. Yeah. Yeah. They did a study on triplets or something, I think, and each one of them had a tiny little bit that was just slightly different.
Just enough to be a little bit different, which makes us all individuals.
Because we know they don't have the same fingerprints.
Right.
So
Well, what is it? You've got the fingerprints, the irises that can be used to distinguish you,
Yeah.
and DNA.
Yeah.
Now, as they identify more markers and stuff, that's probably going to become a lot stronger as far as identifying individualism,
Right.
but it's still there
Mhm.
because we do share enough to make us connected to each other and others.
I have
By
a question.
oh
I have
yes.
one question. I haven't got the book yet. I'm going to get it this week and start reading it. Does he mention, or have you guys ever heard of the term genetic memory?
Yes.
Yeah.
That fascinates me.
Me too.
We discuss that a lot.
Yes.
We do just the different things of, is it genetic memory? Is it, yeah.
And in fact, that makes me want to look at the index real quick, because technically it's a very controversial subject. They call it, it's epigenetics, correct? I think it's epigenetics. So the study of epigenetics that was the those outside strands of DNA that they did, like, for a long time they just didn't think they had any purpose whatsoever. They called them junk strands of the DNA. And then they started doing some studies and they realized that they contained some sort of conditioning memory based on the previous generation. So far, they've studied that in mice. And so you would have, like, a mother mouse went through a maze with, like, some punishment or whatever. They were torturing some poor mouse, I guess. And then what she learned going through there, to avoid the pain or whatever, then they, she had babies. They sent the babies through the maze. The babies knew how to get through the maze. without any of the punishment. So that's what they're trying to show, is that there are some things we pass down. It's a subject I tell people to look into. It's really interesting. We just don't know a whole lot about it yet. And there are some folks that really get deep into it, saying that there's like actual memories that potentially, and so that's the debatable part. Like they don't know how much from the previous generations we get. It's based on, but I think a lot of it has to do with kind of an evolutionary process about, what does the previous generation teach us, and what do we learn? Like, that it's hot on a burner, or, that, dinosaur could eat you, run, you know what I mean? Like different things that
Yeah,
even
fear
animals
factors and
adapt.
stuff.
Yeah, animals adapt to their environment over time. And so there's certain things that I think we know we pass down genetically, but the extent of which we're not really sure. Because then there's also behaviors we pass down to our children and grandchildren and all of that over the years, multiple generations. So there's behavioral things we pass down, but genetically they are discovering there's something in there. And like I said,
Yeah.
we don't know fully yet. So look up the word epigenetics. He does have, in the first edition, he did not cover epigenetics at all. But he does it, he has it in the index I see. And so he's
Okay.
got on page 222, 230 to 232. So he does cover it a little bit. We'll get into it, I guess, a little bit later on. And now I'm actually
Good.
kind of excited to go look and see what he
Yeah.
says, because
Well,
I know it's very
let me tell
controversial.
you, let me tell you why I'm asking. I'm a fiddle player. I grew up classically trained, violin and viola, and I quit music for a while. And when I got back into it, I got into playing bluegrass. And my mother lived in Kentucky, and we've been in Georgia since '71. She had never heard me play any bluegrass music. So she came down one time, she heard us play. She said, my grandfather was a fiddler, just a country fiddler. So I played a song that he used to play, and she said I sounded exactly like him. Now, I was 4 years old the last time I heard him play, so it couldn't be environmental. I wasn't around him that much. He
Right,
was quite elderly when I was born, so I didn't learn from him.
right.
But if I sounded that much like him that she could recognize it,
Yeah.
there has to be something there in my genes.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's when I started looking into that term, and a couple of other people have asked me, and I don't know if there's anything written on it, but I sure would like to explore it.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's some written on it in the book.
Mhm.
I don't know that we're going to have time to kind of cover it in the process we're going through, since we're more looking at matches and work with matches and stuff. But it
Yeah.
is an interesting topic, because what's the difference? And
And in fact, I'll show another little story with that actually, Linda, it was so funny after the reaction, but I don't know why. I mean, I've been doing genealogy since I was 16, and I literally was, completely convinced based on how my family just reported their genealogy, was that we were just, we're as white European as they come. That's all there is. When I had my DNA tested and I put it into GEDmatch, where you can pull out some of the smaller samples of DNA that you have, there was some African DNA in there. Just my mother had about 1%. I had just under 1%. We had the same markers, but I thought it was pretty far. I mean, I thought it was really far back. I thought it was far back that I'd never find it. But I remember in my research trends, things that I liked to research. I liked African American history. I liked, all of this kind of stuff, and I didn't know why. There was always this pull, this draw to study that, all of this, and I remember it was actually closer than I realized, but it was within that 5 generations when I found my 5th great grandmother was a free woman of color in early Kentucky. And Linda looked at me and she says, I knew you'd find it somewhere, someday, because that drive to do that, I couldn't explain it. There was nothing in my family. No one in my family was interested in that, but there was something, and it eventually led me where I needed to go. But yeah, I think there's some things in there that DNA is complicated, and we're just now we're in the infancy really of learning what's all in there.
If you hear any more research has been done on that, I'd sure like to know.
Okay.
That sounds fascinating to me. Thanks.
Mm-hmm. Any
okay,
other question? We're getting close towards the 4 o'clock hour. Any other questions coming to mind? We've covered a lot of stuff, I know, and like I said, there's, take your time reading the stuff that you need to read, and, you can go back and do that. I think that's one thing with, when we first started just the book club, I liked that it made me slow down and read the chapters, and I got to absorb all of that, because a lot of times I would rely on my DNA education was through conferences, and I'd go sit in, an hour-long class and hoping I was going to pick this up. But this book does help us go from the very basic first steps, and it builds on your education and slowly makes me slow down and learn.
Does this work for everybody? I mean, this kind of is the first session. What's your all's feedback? Is there something more you'd like to see in it, or we're going to be digging deeper into things where we will actually
We'll get into painting and matching, and we'll get into more.
painting, matching, coloring?
Yeah, exactly.
Well, I've delved into DNA. I told you I've got it on my DNA plastered all over on all of them. And I have enjoyed this because I've always wanted to sit down and be able to pick the brains of somebody who really knows a lot about it. So just listening to the conversation and what y'all are going back and forth with, I've thoroughly enjoyed it.
Me too. I've learned a lot already.
That's wonderful. That's
Oh,
wonderful.
that's all there is to learn. Sorry.
Yeah, that's it.
I think it's been very helpful this 2 hours. I appreciate what you know and what I certainly don't know. One thing, my wife is an identical twin, and I'm a fraternal twin. And I learned, and of course this is a side here, but I learned that my wife's identical twin has different fingerprints. Her iris of her eye is different, and her DNA is a little bit different.
Yep.
Had no idea. So my wife will appreciate me educating her on that when I get
There
off
you go.
this.
There you go. That's cool.
That's great.
Well, good. And so the next time around, we will check those videos out too. Some of them aren't 15 or 20 seconds or whatever, but I find them helpful. And I don't know what
Yeah, they're really great. As much as Blaine's a great writer as far as, in presenting
Yes.
the topic, I really like how simple he is, but yet, sometimes, like I said, the very first chapter, we gets into a lot of scientific terms. The little Roots Tech videos, those are even shorter and a lot of times visual. So they will kind of chart out some of the concepts that we've talked about. So it's really good to go get those. And just a time limit notification on those. I know we're stretching this out for 6 months. Those little Roots Tech videos will only be available for a year. So by next, a year starting last February. So by February-ish 2022, those videos will no longer be available, because those are time sensitive, but everything else that you're getting is. Also too, the when I said keep handy on the ethics guide. That is through, what is that? It's ISOGG. Is that what it is, Linda?
Yeah, I saw
Yeah.
ISOGG.
Those ethics, those standards put together, that's been put together by a lot of your top genetic genealogists in the field. They're good names to note, because sometimes, YouTube or conferences, you see those names, you're going to get some really good teaching out of them. Also, that website itself, there's going to be some more educational opportunities on that website. So that's one to keep handy to, especially after this course, after you're done with this series. That's another, continuing education site to kind of go back with. And they're also going to be up to date on some current trends. So issues that come out about DNA, they will more than likely have some nice information and reliable information.
Yeah, it's kind of a reliable wiki for DNA.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah, so it has a lot of sources.
Mhm.
Yes. Michael.
Question. We're having our sessions once a month for the 6 months.
Mhm.
And we had a join the Zoom here thing on a recent email distribution. Are y'all going to be sending out reminder emails for each of the new classes that we have?
Yes, because
So I don't need to save this particular email then.
you don't.
Now,
Right.
heads up, you're talking to a non-techie, and that's why I'm asking the question.
I'll tell you what, the big complicated tech question, or the big convoluted answer is, the only thing you really needed to keep was the curriculum out of that email,
Okay.
which was a PDF document. But I can send that. I'll send that every time. That's no big deal. But that's just so that you've got all the readings as you go along. Some people might want to get ambitious and read ahead. The main reason I'm sending you a lot with series like this, I could have set it up where the Zoom event was a repeating and you just had to click on that every time, but people have the option to just buy one class. So therefore I have to send you a new Zoom link with each one of the classes. So be looking for that. Probably about the week before, I'll be sending out a new Zoom link for you to join in. Okay.
And, you know, if you ever come across any questions between now and then, our next session or whatever, just write them down and keep them handy and shoot them.
Yeah, especially as you read, you know, write them down or send them to us ahead of time. Either one is totally fine.
Yeah, because there's all kinds of resources out there. But like I said, sometimes talking it out can make things clearer or confuse things more depending on who you're talking to. But
Thank you both. I've enjoyed it. Thank you both very much.
Great. Alice is waving. Alice is out.
And the chat, we're going to save the chat, aren't we, Sherry?
The only thing we covered in there, it's in the video. Well, I think I said every single thing in the video, so I may not necessarily, it's so short.
Okay, well, I did the DNA Painter link, so
yeah,
that's okay.
DNA Painter link, yeah.
But you guys can save the chat too, but it comes out in like Notepad and kind of funky.
It does. I'll go ahead and copy that and save it. Just in
But I
case
appreciate y'all joining us.
Yes.
And
thank you all. This has been really great. It's been fun. And I like you guys engaged well. You guys asked a lot of questions, comments, and that's perfect. Yeah.
That's what we want. Yeah. And Randall, if you do your DNA between now and then, just holler and we'll wait anxiously with you, and we'll be as surprised and excited and everything.
Thank you.
And just make sure you don't throw your Starbucks cup away where somebody can get a hold of it.
That's right.
Right. Oh gosh. Well, if there's no other questions, I guess we can call it for the day.
Y'all have a great Memorial weekend.
That's right.
Thanks. You too.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.